Welcome to all of you for this talk by my old friends Jordan Ballor and Erik Matson about their newly released books, which you could order on your phones right now, even as you listen to them talk. Each speaker will talk for 10 minutes each, and then follow up, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and comments afterwards. As I pointed out in the invitation, this event is also serving as a launch for IRD's Christians for Capitalism initiative, which we've been planning for a long time. And it actually originated in a dinner involving about 20 people nearly 2 years ago, at which Doug Bandow was present. Stephanie Slade, were you there at that dinner? And there was a consensus that the nation's capital had no organized institutional representation of religious people for free markets and capitalism, and this left a big vacuum that was being filled by alternative voices. So there was agreement that was a problem, but there was no clear solution. So hopefully this new initiative, as it publishes and organizes events like this event, will be part of the solution by creating a new community of Christians for free markets and capitalism here in Washington, D.C. And I believe that Doug Bandow of the Cato Institute has said yes to leading this initiative. So look forward. Doug, would you stand up and raise your hands up in the air? There you are. And yes. So Doug, like myself, has been in Washington forever and knows everybody, and we're looking forward to exporting his expertise and knowledge. So Erik, and I should say that this is being broadcast live on our social media channels. So during the Q&A, please be aware anything you say will transmit out there to whomever is listening, and later the video will post online as well. So Erik, congratulations, and would you like to go first? Although alphabetically, Jordan,
yeah,
you should get priorities. So.
He likes when he wants to dodge something. He says, "My name is on the book first, so I have to go first." So thanks, Mark, for having us. I appreciate it. Well, it's a great pleasure to join you tonight. My name is Jordan Ballor. I have the pleasure of serving as Executive Director of First Liberty Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. Before that, I served in various roles for about 20 years at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. And that's where I come from, a theological background, but that's where my interest in economics and economic history was really formed. And Doug will not remember this, but he was actually a lecturer at the very first event I ever did with the Acton Institute as a student in seminary. And I learned a lot that day and have followed his work, and I'm very grateful for that. Let me just open by saying a little bit about why we took this project on, what we're trying to do with it, before I turn it over to Erik to talk a little bit more about what we're actually doing in the volumes and in the project. So why the history of Christian political economy? On a fateful day in 1972 at the University of Chicago, a faculty senate decided to strike the mandatory requirement for a history of economics course in the PhD program. I think it was a day, it may not have been a faculty senate meeting, I'm taking some liberties with that story, but I'm depending on John Mueller in his book, Redeeming Economics, who points to this as certainly a symbolic, but also an important kind of turn in economics as a modern discipline. So what does this represent? Well, by John's account and by many others, there's different versions of the story that could be told, but certainly by the third quarter and second half of the 20th century, the history of economic thought had fallen out of favor in terms of the larger discipline. There's a story that can be told there, and that we do some accounting for in our volume with respect to the modern development of economics. But this is a symbolic and an important turning point, because the discipline, understood as a kind of a positive enterprise as opposed to something that is historically grounded, really the historic elements of the discipline drop out. There are attendant kinds of things you could think about in terms of the philosophy and methodology of economics. But if you look at the state of the discipline today, there is a sub-discipline. There is an active group of scholars engaged in the history of economic thought. It's small. They do excellent work on the whole. It's very interesting to scholars like Erik and myself, but it's definitely a sub-discipline perhaps, and not in the mainstream of what is taught in economics. So you can easily get a graduate and even a doctoral education in economics without having done any work in the history of economic thought. Now, there are volumes on the history of economic thought, including survey texts and primary source readers and things of that nature. My training is in intellectual history, historical theology, and moral theology, and one of my specialty areas is the Reformation. So I'm used to thinking about things hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Of course, there are many historians who do work in their specialties far earlier than that. But I sometimes joke that the history of economic thought means that the historians who do that economic history work and the history of economic thought work go all the way back to Adam Smith. I am a huge fan of Adam Smith, but he, relative to the baseline of human history, he was pretty recent, right? Now, for us, we moderns now in 2026, 250 years ago was a long time. We're remembering the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Smith's magnum opus was published in The Wealth of Nations that same year in 1776. But the history of economic thought typically, not exclusively, but often just goes back to Adam Smith. It's a great place to go, but there's stuff that's even older than that that's important. Sometimes you'll see treatments of the history of economic thought that go all the way back, say, to Aristotle. They may touch on figures including Augustine, certainly very important and known to many in this room, and Thomas Aquinas. You could call those the 3 A's of pre-Adam Smith economic history. That's one of the ways that John Mueller talks about it, for example. He does treat Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas in articulating what he calls a neo-scholastic view of economics. So economic history, the history of economic thought, often goes all the way back to Adam Smith. Sometimes it goes back earlier, but if it does, it tends to touch very briefly on these kinds of figures. Now, there are certainly specialized studies of various aspects of economic history or the history of economic thought or economic theory that are more narrow and they go deeper, right? They may talk about the Spanish scholastics, for example, in the 16th and 17th centuries. They may talk about pre-Smithian thought in the 18th century. They may talk about the economic thought of the Patristics. So there certainly are specialized works that can be consulted for the history of economic thought before Smith. But when we looked out at that landscape of literature, we couldn't find anything that was quite what we had conceived of in thinking about a history of economic thought from a Christian perspective. There are certainly primary source anthologies talking about the history of Christian social thought or Christian political thought. And in some ways, our project here is analogous to those things, but we're really focused more on political economy and economics as opposed to, say, politics as such. Why else should we look at the history of Christian political economy? And now I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Christian side of things when we're talking about the history. I've talked more generally just about the history of economic thought, but why focus more narrowly on Christian contributions? Well, there are many good reasons. Among those, I think there's something analogous in the history of economic thought to what we see in something like the oft-discussed, much maligned, much misunderstood, much mischaracterized and much discussed Weber thesis, the Max Weber thesis, something analogous to the Merton thesis with respect to the role of religion and specifically Christianity in the development of modern science as well as modern economics. If you look back at the important figures in the history of economic thought, many of them, certainly in the West, are Christians. To some extent, their Christianity informs their work. And so that's one of the reasons we wanted to focus more narrowly on Christian contributions, not only given our own interests and my own training as a theologian and so on. So it isn't the case, we wouldn't claim, that the history of economic thought is the history of Christian political economic thought as such. But the history of Christian political economic thought is an important stream, and perhaps even a dominant stream, within the development of modern economics. One other thing that we wanted to try to accomplish with this project was to address a really important and significant but oft overlooked separation. We can even use a stronger word, a divorce between theology and economics. I mentioned before the Acton Institute, which is been dedicated to bringing theology and economics back into conversation and to reconciling these things, these disciplines. Part of an understanding of the more modern and more recent history of economic thought is that there's an increasing separation as time goes on between economics and moral claims in general, but certainly Christian theological claims. So what we have now in the year 2026 is an almost complete divorce between theology and economics, broadly speaking. So on the academic side of things, you could think about our project as an attempt to bring these two disciplines back into fruitful dialogue. I'm a theologian who is economically curious, and I think that theology has something that it can learn from economics as a discipline. I think I'm in the vast minority of theologians when I have that kind of a posture, however. I'm not the only theologian who thinks we can learn something from economics, but that is not the typical posture between theologians and economists. So one of the things we wanted to do was to help open up space for more fruitful dialogue between these two academic disciplines. But much more practically as well, we think there's a great deal of wisdom to be found in the broad sweep of Christian history, Christian intellectual history, as well as Christian reflections, especially on the material world, on the temporal order, on God's provision for our material needs, and so on. And so one of the practical aims of the project was to help us to recover, or at least to get the sense that we might be missing something if we don't have this kind of historical focus on the wisdom of ages past. And in this sense, we think that some of the wisdom that we've helped to uncover, pointed towards in this project, can help us to think better about economic realities, help us to be better stewards of the gifts that God has given us, and in that way to be better disciples. The Catholic philosopher Etienne Gilson said that piety is no substitute for technique. And it's precisely that kind of a posture that we think is necessary for bringing economics and theology into fruitful dialogue. Just a little bit about the particulars of the project itself, some of the logistics, before I turn it over to Erik to talk about some of the attempts we made to bring some coherence to this broad sweep of dealing with 2,000 years plus of Christian reflections on economics. There are 2 volumes. One is, as Mark mentioned, a primary source volume that provides selections from different periods of Christian history. So we start in the patristic, the early church era, move through the early medieval, the late medieval, the early modern era, and so on up through the 20th century. And so there's selections from across Christian traditions and a range of writings that reflect in some way on economic realities from a Christian perspective. The second volume is a survey textbook. So it's an attempt within a few hundred pages to cover that broad sweep of history, organized in the same structure as the primary source volume. So they're designed to be read together if you would like to do it that way. Dealing with the major questions in economic theory as well as economic ethics that we found to be relevant in each one of those periods. And so those are the kind of structures of the books and the project as a whole and how they fit together in the 2 volumes. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Erik to discuss a little bit more about the narrative that we try to produce in terms of something coherent and worthwhile to be said about those 2,000 years. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jordan. It's good to be with you all this evening. Thanks to Mark Tooley and to the IRD for organizing this event. I'm Erik Matson. I am a fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University, and I'm also a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. Let me just say a little bit more about our motivation, at least my motivation. Maybe I won't drag Jordan into this so much. But I'm interested in, I'm trained in economics, and I'm interested in the question, how should Christians think about economics? And there are different ways you can go about answering that question. And in some sense, what we are trying to do in this book, although we don't put it in these terms in the book, is to address that question by surveying the things that Christians have thought about economics through out the course of many centuries. So in some broad sense, that's really what this project is about. We're interested in the relationship of society to its material wealth. That's one way you can think about the definition of the phrase political economy, and the kinds of opinions that Christians have had about those issues for thousands of years. So in some respect, historically speaking, there really is no such thing as Christian political economy. You don't find any kind of uniform perspective on political economic issues throughout Christian history. What you find are people who call themselves Christians dealing with and wrestling with political economic issues over the course of thousands of years. And so that is fundamentally what we survey in the book. And it's an incredibly ambitious project, but it's one that we've certainly learned a lot from, and hopefully it will have some utility for people going forward. So let me just say a little bit about the broad conceptual framework that we use to try to impose some kind of order on the wide array of sources that we deal with in the volumes. You can think about two broad competing perspectives on economic issues. If you think about economic issues as the study of the production and distribution of resources, the first perspective you could call a limited good perspective, and we use this terminology some in the book, and the second is a mutual benefits perspective. The limited good perspective holds that riches and material wealth are essentially fixed within the relevant window of analysis, and at some point, therefore, transactions and individual pursuits will be zero-sum. The gain of one is the loss of another. The mutual benefits perspective, on the other hand, holds that wealth and material plenty can continue to increase, maybe not indefinitely, but very far into the foreseeable future. And so on this point of view, the good of one need not come at the cost of the good of the many. One individual's wealth does not need to preclude the wealth of others. Exchange, moreover, doesn't just shift around existing wealth, but can actually be wealth generative. So if you think about this in kind of broad theological terms, it seems evident that the biblical perspective is one of mutual benefits, at least at the highest level. God blesses Abraham in Genesis so that he can in turn be a blessing to the nations. Israel is brought out of exile in Egypt to make God's name known and to be a vehicle of God's grace to the world. In the writings of the prophets, God repeatedly promises to preserve a remnant of Israel, through which, again, the nations will be blessed and humankind will be redeemed. And this culminates in the coming of Christ, in whom we are, according to the Apostle Paul, blessed by God the Father with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms. But then the question is, how does this relate to material blessing in the earthly realm, which is the principal concern of economics? So what does Christianity have to say on this front? There's an excellent book for those of you who are interested in these issues. It's an older book. It's written by Barry Gordon, who passed away in the early 90s, but it's called The Economic Problem in Biblical and Patristic Thought. And we use this book a little bit to motivate our approach. And so Barry Gordon, in that book, he draws out 7 approaches to scarcity that you can find in the biblical authors. And let me just briefly say something about 4 of these. So the first he calls the solution by faith. And this proposes that God will provide for the needs of his people, both spiritual and material, at the proper time. You can see this solution throughout the Torah. For example, the Exodus journey, when God, so to speak, breaks the budget constraint and manna and quail come down from the heavens. And this evidently has something of a mutual benefits aspect to it. So scarcity is alleviated. The budget constraint is escaped, and as all good economists know, when your income increases, when your budget constraint shifts outwards, then consumption opportunities grow. So the next solution, Barry Gordon calls the solution by wisdom. And the idea here is that scarcity can be overcome and material blessings secured if one obeys God's commands and lives within the confines of the natural law generally and the Levitical law specifically. And this solution resonates with the themes developed in subsequent natural law traditions, and it actually resonates into classical economic theory as well. The third solution that we discuss briefly in the book is called the solution by mediation. And I won't go into this here, but the idea is that Israel will prosper if she acts as an intermediary between God and the nations, both spiritually and ethically, for the good both of Israel and the surrounding nations. You could look, for example, to the book of Jeremiah when God commands his people to build houses, to plant gardens, to tend to the welfare of the city. There's a final solution that I'll mention, which is called the solution by seeking the kingdom. In a way, this connects back to the solution by faith, but it emphasizes the importance of community life and charitable giving. And the signal texts here come from the Gospels. So you can see there are different kinds of ideas about dealing with, overcoming, or at least alleviating the problem of scarcity that you can find in the biblical texts. And they're not necessarily in conflict. They can maybe be balanced, but you can draw different kinds of interpretations from them, which is what we see throughout the history of Christian thought. Let me just say a little bit about these two perspectives, the limited good and the mutual benefits perspective. And you can find resonances of these perspectives in all of these different solutions that Barry Gordon constructs. I want to just give you a sense of a few of the characters in the book, a few standout perspectives in the history of Christian reflection on these issues. So if you want some decent expressions of the limited good perspective, you can look to the Patristics, to the early church fathers. Now, it's very difficult to interpret the social and economic thought of the church fathers because they were operating in such a different social and political context. The Roman political economy was fundamentally different from the political economy that we operate in today. We find tremendous dissatisfaction in the church fathers with Roman property arrangements, and we find many representations of these arrangements as economically unproductive and as violating God's gift of the earth to men in common. So let me just briefly say something about John Chrysostom. Chrysostom gives voice to the view that poverty is essentially caused by the rich. So modern economics is kind of unique in the sense that it attempts to explain wealth. Certainly for the church fathers and for many subsequent theologians, poverty was the thing that needed to be explained. Economists don't really spend a lot of time explaining poverty. I tell my students, if you want to know where poverty comes from, go camping, don't bring any supplies, just wear the clothes on your back. It's relatively straightforward. But this is not the perspective that we find throughout history. So Chrysostom argues that poverty is caused by the rich. God gave the earth to humankind to be shared and to be cultivated cooperatively. Some people seized land for themselves, forcing others to work for them for subsistence, alienating those workers from their produce. To not share one's possession with others who are less fortunate is actually equivalent to robbery. This point comes across in Chrysostom's commentary on the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16. So here's a quote from his commentary. "This is robbery, not to share one's resources. Perhaps what I am saying astonishes you. Yet be not astonished. For I shall offer you the testimony of sacred scripture, which say that not only to rob others' property, but also not to share your own with others is robbery and greediness and theft." The thrust of his economic ethics and social teaching comes across in the following passage. "For mine and thine, those chilly words which introduce innumerable wars into the world, should be eliminated from that holy church. The poor would not envy the rich, because there would not be rich. Neither would the poor be despised by the rich, for there would be no poor. All things would be common." So it's not hard to see why some refer to Chrysostom as an early kind of socialist. I don't think that label is particularly useful. He did not advance anything like socialism as a coherent political ideology. But regardless, his economic thought, you can see something of this limited good kind of perspective. So fast forwarding now to the 19th century, to the great unsung hero of the Baptist intellectual tradition, Francis Wayland. Francis Wayland was part of a group that has been described by, well, I forget the scholar who came up with this phrase, May, I think. May called this group of scholars the clerical laissez-faire. And Wayland was representative of this school. So he was an interesting character. He became president of Brown University In 1827, at age 31, he wrote a book on moral philosophy, and then he wrote what became one of the most popular economic textbooks in America in the 19th century, called The Elements of Political Economy. And so Wayland described the laws of political economy, by which he meant the laws that had been uncovered and promulgated by the classical economic tradition in the 18th century. He described these laws as the laws to which God had subjected humanity in the pursuit of wealth. And he makes a very clear claim along these lines. Every benefit, he says, is mutual, and we cannot, in the one case, any more than the other, really do good to ourselves without doing good to others, nor do good to others without also doing good to ourselves, rather. So for Wayland believed that God has created man with faculties adapted to physical and intellectual labor. God has made labor necessary to the attainments of the means of happiness. We are so constituted that physical and intellectual labor are essential to health. God has attached special penalties to idleness, such as ignorance, poverty, cold, and hunger. God has assigned rich and abundant rewards to industry. And Wayland concludes that we are to construct the arrangements of society as to give free scope to the laws of divine providence. So he understands the exchange economy, free exchange within the rules of property and contract, as having a providential aspect. It's the way that human beings cooperate with one another to increase plenty and to fulfill the first commandment, to be fruitful and to multiply and to cultivate the earth. So we're careful in the book. Both of us believe that the mutual benefits perspective has much more to it. Modern economic science demonstrates the power of exchange, the productivity of the price system, the division of labor, which can only come about through a system of free exchange. The world that we all live in and enjoy is a product of mutually beneficial voluntary exchange relationships. But we don't argue in the book that there's some kind of progression throughout Christian history from a kind of limited good to a mutual benefits perspective. You can find both of these perspectives throughout all of the ages of the church, expressed in different contexts and different forms. So that's a little bit of the character of again, the order that we try to impose on all these sources insofar as there is one. But really, we're just attempting to survey these sources, to bring forward different authors and figures who deserve a second or first reading by intellectual historians and also just Christian lay people. Thank you.
You want to respond to your co-author, or go straight to questions and comments?
Well, I'll just say one thing, and it'll pick up on Erik's last point, which is when we were trying to think about a way to construct a narrative that would hold things together, we came up with this dynamic between the limited good and the mutual benefits perspective. And my first instinct, at least, was that it was going to be a kind of a developmental story, right? So one of the things that you have to account for when you're dealing with the history of economics and economic history itself is the so-called hockey stick graph of GDP per capita over time, right? Which is basically a flat line until about the 18th century. And so there are various explanations for what happened then and why we've experienced such kinds of growth. One of my favorite variables or causal factors, not a monocausal explanation, is a kind of a change in mindset, right? That valorizes economic exchange as something in which can be mutually beneficial. And so my sense was maybe we get an insight, something like that Adam Smith articulates and others in the classical era, that foregrounds this kind of mutual benefits perspective. And maybe it was something like a new discovery or it wasn't dominant and so on. But it turns out when we looked at the sources that it is not a progressive story in that way in terms of thinking about the intellect. Like, it is a progressive story if you're looking at economic growth, but it's not a progressive story in the sense that somebody in the 18th century discovered that we could trade mutually beneficially, right? You do find both of these perspectives throughout all of history, as Erik said. And so it's that kind of dynamic that we try to trace throughout the book. So that's just a little bit more of kind of depth on that element of the narrative. Thanks, Mark.
Questions or comments?
What is the place that you give to the Spanish scholastics, the School of Salamanca? And do you see much internal um, conflicts, infighting. I'm thinking of like the earliest ones, obviously Victoria, and later ones like Tomás de Mercado. That I think they have some quite radically different views.
So we do spend, I don't want to say a great deal of time. We do spend some time on the second scholastics, especially the Spanish scholastics. That is an area, I mentioned a few examples of areas of economic thought before Adam Smith that have gotten some specialized attention, and that is one of the areas for sure. Speaking for myself, I think of that as an area in an era of great development with respect to insights into economics, specifically by Christian thinkers. We do include Vittoria in the sources volume, and he's kind of our representative of the second scholastics. Obviously, there are many other figures that we could have included, but we chose Vittoria as one of the 7 in that period to include. Although I think we also have Lessius, which he was Belgian, but he was trained in the Iberian Peninsula, so you could include him as at least a kind of a Hispanic scholastic in that sense. So advances in economic theory. This is another one of the dynamics I think that we try to bring out in the book is there's a great deal of Christian reflection that operates at the level essentially of ethics, right? So it's making ethical judgments about economic realities. And then there are, throughout Christian history, Christians who are making developments and claims with respect to what you could call economic theory. And certainly the scholastics are doing, the neo-scholastics, the second scholastics are doing both. One example, one kind of anecdote about how those two things relate. So Lessius is a moral theologian. He's confronted with a question about the legitimacy of some commercial practice. And if he were a lazier theologian, perhaps like I am, he might sit in his chair and speculate about, the relevant factors and make a judgment based on that speculation. An armchair kind of moral theologizing. What Lessius did actually was to go down to the marketplace and do a little bit of field research, ask the people who were the relevant actors how they understood the activity that they were doing from the inside, you could say, or at least their self-understanding of what these practices were and represented. And it's not that he just simply valorized everything that he was told, but he did that kind of empirical work before rendering the relevant moral and theological judgments about it. So that's one anecdote about the kind of ethos that is characteristic, I think, of the Spanish scholastics and is a salutary kind of example. Erik, do you want to say anything?
We deal with the Spanish scholastics mostly when we discuss the issue of the just price and the issue of usury. And they had quite a lot of important things to say on that front. A lot of their views ended up passing into classical economics through Hugo Grotius, who studied Lessius, and he read the School of Salamanca, Samuel von Pufendorf as well. Grotius and Pufendorf are then read by Gershom Carmichael and Francis Hutcheson and some other Scottish men of letters that you may or may not have heard of. And then this gets passed into the curriculum at Edinburgh and Glasgow and becomes part of classical economics. So they're very important in that respect. I'll share one anecdote that we came across. At one point, there was a merchant who went to confession, and his confessor had no idea what to make of his situation. And so his confessor brought the merchant's account to doctors of theology at Paris. One of the doctors was Francisco de Vitoria, and they had no idea what to make of the situation. The merchant was asking, is it just for me to make a profit changing money in this way or in that way? And what's the just rate of return? And to Vittoria, it was clear that none of the doctors of the church had any idea what they were talking about. So they all just rushed to condemn the merchant's activity, including Vittoria. But subsequently, he became quite interested in matters of valuation and became more interested in just price, the question of usury, whether it's licit to charge interest, whether money changing is a just activity in and of itself. Another interesting point that kind of follows on from that observation is that much of the economic thought that you find in the medieval period actually comes in the manuals of confessors over just price practice and usury and so forth. So it's a very difficult terrain to kind of navigate for a modern, especially if you don't read Latin, which I don't, by the way. The school of Salamanca was also the first to articulate the quantity theory of money, I think. Martín de Azpilicueta, so he should get credit for that.
So besides the 3As and the Salamanca school or the Spanish scholastics, are there other figures that maybe we wouldn't be as familiar with that you might want to like introduce us to here? Because I'm very interested in who has been skipped over in the history that I've read so far.
Well, you should read the School of Salamanca. There's a lot of worthwhile literature. As far as other characters, it depends what your interests are. You know, we have a wide variety of texts that we include. Some of the texts, for example, we include an excerpt from Catherine of Siena, which is broadly speaking about the mutual benefits of commerce with our neighbors. So it's a moral theological work, but it gets to fundamental ethical issues about economics. From the Church Fathers, Origen has a lot of excellent material on the division of labor. The one outstanding argument that you find against slavery in the Patristics is Gregory of Nyssa. So if you're not familiar with that source, I highly recommend that. As far as modern source, look at the table of contents on the sources volume. I'll point out one other modern character. Kaidenius was a Swedish-Finnish Lutheran minister, wrote a work called The National Gain, which I think you can find online, the translation in English. But he's been called before the Scandinavian Adam Smith. He wrote about 30 years before Adam Smith. So he's certainly a worthwhile figure that most people don't pay much attention to. There's so many gems, but in terms of big standout characters, you know, part of the motivation is to sort of unearth figures who I wouldn't necessarily tell people to go read, but nonetheless I think have important insights and are useful for people to be broadly aware of. So it's not as if I want to teach a class on Kaidenius, but I think he's worth a few hours of reading, as many of the characters on our table of contents are. I don't know, any other standout characters?
Yeah, let me just say that was one of the, I think, challenging but also most enjoyable parts of the project was to try to identify figures who we could include in the sources part of it, but then also in the narrative, and many of whom are going to be unfamiliar to most people, right? Well, not maybe have heard the name, but certainly haven't engaged with the sources and so on. So I'll give you an example of one that I would just recommend in terms of like a figure that I have read profitably and want to read more, and I think everybody should spend some time reading this figure, and that's Wilhelm Röpke. So that name may be familiar to many of you in the room or not, but is not as well known as he ought to be. So a 20th century Lutheran economist, a contemporary of Hayek, and somebody who was deeply engaged in an attempt to kind of articulate, in I think a responsible and really insightful way, the truths of economics and integrate those into the truths of the Christian tradition, but especially the Christian tradition's teachings about the human person. So I'd recommend Röpke. There are some original contributions in the volume. Some of them are reprints of things that otherwise appear, and we give the full bibliographic citation so you can go back and read the full source, which we would always recommend. These are kind of excerpts and tidbits. One of the original pieces that's in there in translation into English for the first time is Gratian's Decretum, Causa 14, which is the big, most important section in canon law dealing with questions of exchange, justice in economic relationships. So that's in the English for the first time in this sources volume.
I'll give you two more names since Stephanie is something of a libertarian. Nicole Orem and Juan de Mariana on the injustice of inflation. Really top-notch, in my view.
I like Mariana's treatise on the alteration of money. That's a great read. The Acton Institute has a very accessible full translation of that. Insights there into the manipulation of money by the sovereign and so on. There's a fun story about Mariana having published it in Latin. The king doesn't like it, so he throws him into prison. So what Mariana does while he's in prison is write a vernacular translation and version of the treatise. I had an interesting story in terms of trying to find that source, because this was the early days of primary sources being digitized and available on Google Books. And the first couple of places that I looked had been expurgated. So these were the ones that were in Spain and held by Spanish libraries. And that treatise and the collection of the 7 treatises had been ripped out, and in some cases, noted on the title page. But I did find it in Vienna. So in the Vienna archive, the full version was there. But anyway.
Please excuse me if this is an unrelated question, but I think that there have been periods in history where Christianity has undergone periods of revival and increased zeal, and it's been lately reported that there are more people in this country becoming religious for the first time in a long time. And I was wondering whether in these periods of revival or awakening, that there has been any corresponding change in the economic environment.
So the question had to do with revival, increased maybe numbers, but also enthusiasm for Christianity throughout history, and whether that corresponds in any way to changes in the economic environment. The first thing I think of in response to that is a kind of both a biblical and a historical kind of, I wouldn't quite want to call it a law of nature, but a kind of a perennial trend that you tend to see. And you see this throughout the Old Testament, a cycle of prosperity in response or out of God's bounteous grace bestowed on his people, including material prosperity, followed by corresponding apostasy and decadence, and God's judgment that follows. The people from their idolatry cry out to God for deliverance. He in turn blesses them, including in material ways, and they turn from God in their affluence and forget that they need him, and so on and so forth. You see this throughout the Old Testament. And I think it is a kind of a feature of fallen human nature that the more blessed we are, certainly materially, the more difficult it is to see all the good that you have as coming from God and requiring corresponding responsibility and duty towards him. It's easy to become an idolater. It's always, I'm a Calvinist, so I think we're all idolaters almost all the time, but it's really easy to be an idolater in the context of material plenty. So that's just a general answer to that kind of, offhand in human history, I'd have to think more deeply about, ways that kind of a principle or that kind of a thematic is expressed.
Here's the famous quote by Doug Wesley: "The fruit of these revivals, people prosper and, illustrating exactly what he says. Became self-support in your prosperity, Danto."
I certainly think it would be hard to trace any connection between the changes in economic thought and religious revival. Maybe you could do it, but I think that would be very hard to do. And off the top of my head, it doesn't really seem that plausible to think that the contours of economic thought, published works, changed that substantially. But I could be wrong. It would be hard to investigate.
Certainly sociologically, you have the dynamics of decadence and renewal as exemplified in the history of monasticism and so on. And even within monasticism, the orders that were originally, aimed at a plain and simple life, quickly the monks become, maybe they don't have personal property, but the monasteries become very wealthy and so on, which sparks a renewal movement from within that renewal, what had been an original renewal movement and so on. So that's an example maybe in a more particular way of that kind of dynamic too.
Hi, can you tie the Pope's recent encyclical on artificial intelligence into the history of Christian economic thought?
Yeah, so the question is about the Pope's most recent encyclical. I confess I haven't read it yet. I will say that Erik and I are working on an article on AI, economics, and theology, and one of our mandates is to include engagement with the Pope's encyclical in that article. So I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I plan to. And if you give me your information, I'm happy to send you the final text when we develop it.
Well, I think just I don't have great familiarity with the document, but there are tools. We can use tools for purposes that glorify God and enrich our neighbors materially and spiritually, or we can use tools in ways that are corrupting. And we can use tools to build idols. We can use our gifts and our talents to build and embellish the tabernacle, or we can use our gifts and our tools to build golden calves. And so that's a theme that I think is broadly biblical, and you find it manifesting in different ways throughout the history of Christian reflections on economics. It, of course, connects to Rerum Novarum, which was Leo XIII's encyclical, in the sense that Leo XIII recognized that innovation is a good, but it's not an ultimate good. And when we make tools, when we make technologies into ultimate goods, then they become idols. Mark mentioned Wesley. I should have said some more about Wesley in my remarks, because of course Wesley has a great sermon on the use of money, and in that sermon he advances a triple exhortation to the faithful Christian: to gain as much as he can, to save as much as he can, and to give as much as he can. And that makes sense insofar as it goes, but if you read the sermon is also full of qualifications. You have to consider the nature of the activity that you are involved in. You have to consider the effects of your trade on your physical health, on your neighbor's health, on your soul, most importantly of all. And so in that sense, I think there's a great deal of consistency, or at least resonance, between Wesley and the recent encyclical. So those are some just very broad comments. Again, we're working through this actively.
Yeah, excuse me, just a comment and a question on going back to the earlier question about prosperity and religious commitment. I wonder if a connecting fact is not prosperity per se, but the illusion of control, that you don't need anything. Farmers tend to be more religious because they know that things may happen out of their control and there's no crop next year. And with the questions of AI, we're getting two things happening. People who believe they're going to be gods because they're going to upload themselves into something. So they control their destiny. We shall be as gods. And the other one is the tremendous uncertainty of what's going to happen with AI. So I think in that setting, you're starting to get much more interest in religion. That is, we don't know what's going on, and we don't know how to control it, and we're aware of our weakness. So, I'm sorry, this is not a question, but going back to Francis Bacon, of the reasoning turns from not seeking to find the truth, but seeking to remake the world in such a way as we want it. And again, I think those questions of whether or not we control our own destiny lie at the root of this, and that does have a connection with wealth, obviously. If my soul, you have plenty enough rest. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, just a quick thought on that kind of theme. I think one way of thinking about what economics is describing it as the science of human providence. Right? The science of human providence. So what we do with respect to what we expect to happen on the basis of our actions. And of course, there's a whole metaphysical question there about how our secondary causal activity relates to divine providence. And you could think of that in zero-sum terms, but you can also think of that in terms of non-conflict and God's kind of broader superintendence and so on. So that's just a quick thought, Paul, in response to some of those observations. But certainly, I mean, it sounds a little bit like a cliche, I think, because I tend to think in these terms all the time and talk about them all the time. But primary with any question related to economics and discipleship more generally is that of stewardship. And of course, stewardship immediately involves the question of norms and constraints on moral and ethical, as well as material constraints on what you can do, and a mandate to do that within the will of your superior, ultimately God. So.
Yeah, I'm just curious your guys' thinking around investing. When you invest in something like an index fund, and it can be extremely hard to understand all parties, I guess, intentions. What's our obligation as Christians to do our due diligence to ensure that like everything's, in the pursuit of the kingdom of God and not, evil per se?
Okay. Did you hear that? Yeah.
That's a good question. So I suppose what you're asking is, do we have an obligation to look into the details, the relevant details of all of the companies that are represented in the index fund? Something like an index fund. I'm not sure. To be honest, it is something that I have thought about and don't have a particularly well thought out position on. I invest in index funds. I think, generally speaking, investment is a fantastic activity. It enables people to start businesses, to expand businesses, to hire people, to create, to produce. I think investment is a biblical idea. It's at the heart of a prosperous economy. We do have an obligation, I think, as Jordan was saying, to steward our funds and to invest in things that are, broadly speaking, serving the good. And we, I think, do have a measure of responsibility. There are certain businesses that I would not invest in as a matter of principle. It's a challenging issue. I'm not sure. Maybe I should be doing more homework and looking at my portfolio. Jordan?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It is one that bears directly on the question of stewardship. Just a few thoughts unsystematically related to that. I do think there is great opportunity in complex environments like this for essentially something like a division of labor, right? And so you already see that in investing in a general way, because you can have an investment advisor who is tasked with knowing more things than you do personally about the intricate workings and so on. And of course, there are those kinds of services that are provided by those who would share convictions with respect to certain kinds of activities or industries and so on. And so it is definitely possible to engage in investing in a way that is more careful, even without you spending the time yourself doing that kind of due diligence, right? So that's something that occurs to me. Obviously, that's not what's happening in index fund. You're just investing broadly in that market. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose the other thing, you have to ask how much can we reasonably expect to know about the things that we spend our money on, the things that we invest in? Certainly something. But at some point, I couldn't even tell you what all the components in this iPad are. I couldn't tell you where they all come from. Does that mean I shouldn't buy the iPad? There are certainly, at some point, I imagine, people who have done unethical things that have contributed to the production of this iPad. But there has to be some kind of compromise between practical limitations and personal responsibility, and trust that you operate in a system with reasonable rules and people acting in good faith. So it has to be a prudential question. I'm not sure that you could dictate any kind of solution on high, like these are the 25 companies only that you can invest in. I do know that there are some financial products out there that try to advertise themselves as kind of responsible index funds that have been vetted by people of faith. And I support that, but I don't think it's wrong to invest in an index fund either.
I'll just say two other quick things. And one is to piggyback off of what Erik just said, and that's something that I think is universalizable in the sense that it's an aspect of our moral responsibility that is underappreciated, and that has to do with the problem of proximity, is one way of thinking about it. And that proximity is a relevant factor in someone's moral responsibility with respect to anything, but it would include something like this. So, there are different ways of articulating that in a more kind of systematic fashion. Subsidiarity is certainly a doctrine that is an attempt by well-developed in Roman Catholic social teaching that would, I think, have some bearing on the kind of question you're talking about more broadly with respect to complex economic relationships beyond investing. I will also say there's work that's being done at the level of governance of firms and shareholder responsibility and those sorts of things. And that's also maybe not exactly what you were asking, but I think it's a relevant dynamic to think about. That what are you doing when you own a stock in a company? Many of us perhaps are just thinking about the profit margin, but with any kind of ownership comes responsibilities too. And I think this is an area where Christians have underappreciated their responsibilities, but also the role that they can play in terms of taking active governance responsibilities within various companies and so on. And there are groups doing this kind of work right now too, that are trying to raise that kind of level of awareness and do that work with respect to corporate governance.
I'm just curious your guys' thinking around balancing everything that everything we've been talking about has been very mind oriented or logical or thinking focused. How do you balance that with the Holy Spirit and something that isn't quite necessarily data or facts? How do you use the discernment of the Holy Spirit amongst something that is very analytical by nature to make good decisions, I guess?
Just a couple of small comments. One, if your conscience tells you that you shouldn't invest in a certain product, pay attention to your conscience, do your homework. When you're discerning your vocation, economics, we're talking about economic thought, but economics is about making iPads and making sandwiches and cleaning toilets and all the kind of mundane activities that really make up the world that we live in. And so when you're thinking about your work, think about what kind of work you should be doing, how you can serve others in the context of your work, how to glorify God in the context of your work. Listen to the Holy Spirit's promptings in the context that you find yourself in. So thinking about economics, economic thought is an intellectual enterprise, but economics is just an extension of ordinary life, which is a Christian, it's suffused with the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit needs to be present in all aspects of our economic activity and our economic thinking, but that gets a little bit more difficult because, it's not as if you're a mathematician, how does the Holy Spirit inform your study of mathematics? That's a different set of questions, right? So you have to kind of disambiguate the relevant domain that you were thinking about.
I guess I would just briefly say that, God, by means of the Holy Spirit or through the work of the Holy Spirit, gives us all kinds of gifts and empowers us in all kinds of ways. And one of those ways, one of the fruits of the Spirit is wisdom. And it's a very biblical kind of mandate, a command for us to pursue wisdom, to get wisdom, and to pray for and to welcome and to cultivate that fruit of the Spirit as much as we possibly can. And I do think that economics and the right use of our material wealth is it's a heavy and weighty responsibility that calls for much wisdom. And so one of the basic ways of understanding stewardship is that the more you're given, the more is expected of you. And the more you have, the more wisdom you need to be faithful in response to that. And so obviously the work of the Spirit, the gifting of the Spirit is absolutely necessary for that.
So I was thinking about the hockey stick. Now there's a lot of different disparity in wealth across the world. And the hockey stick takes place at different places, different times in different countries. And there's certain ideas that get a warm reception. Like there's the book guns, germs, and steel. Talks a lot about, it's kind of the natural environment that's driving it. People are comfortable with, it's the government institutions. I think there was a Nobel Prize in that recently that's kind of driving it. Do you have any feeling that bringing Christianity into this, some people might feel it's kind of impolite? Like, it's kind of Western centric. We shouldn't bring it in there. And if we don't bring it in, what are we missing?
I think lots of people feel that it's impolite. I can give you an example. One of the greatest books, I think, on the Industrial Revolution, a set of books, is by Deirdre McCloskey. And she goes out of her way to say that the cultural transformation did not have anything to do with Christianity, which I think is historically implausible, and it's an incorrect assertion. So I think the kind of cultural transformation that she catalogs and argues correctly, in my view, contributed so much to the great enrichment and cultural transformation of the last 300 years, owes a lot to Christianity. Now, saying precisely what it owes and what the specific mechanism that channeled Christian ideas and values in a certain time and a certain place, that's incredibly difficult. So it's not plausible to say that Christianity generates massive economic growth, period. That doesn't work. Empirically, it doesn't work historically, because there are many Christian parts of the world that have not developed. But I do think that Christianity was instrumental, necessary, but not sufficient to the cultural transformation. And you can see it in so many of the Christian writers and Christian political theorists and Christian economists of the 17th and 18th and 19th century. Richard Baxter is somebody that Max Weber writes about frequently, but there are many other Christian churchmen and laypersons who make the case that it's decent and honorable to pursue a life of commerce, to trade, to innovate, to invent. And so in some real sense, I think Christians christened, so to speak, the pursuit of honest income and private enterprise in a time and in a place. And you can have different conversations about the precise effect of that and why that happened, but I do think it was fundamental. And I do think we lose something both in terms of historical argument and in terms of thinking about the culture that we need to sustain a decent, prosperous society. I think that is something that we lose when we axe that out of the history.
Time for final questions.
Hi. So I guess the verdict is still out on whether AI will be creating more jobs as past technologies have, or if it will be a tremendous loss of jobs. But some of the predictions you hear by AI experts, for example, will have $10 million companies with 5 employees and the rest run by robotics and AI. The shareholders will be delighted because they're making a lot of money, and those 5 people will be making a lot of money, but regular workers will be out of jobs. Or, for example, the idea that automated trucks may take over the jobs of truck drivers. So I'm just wondering if you have any preliminary thoughts as you're doing your research at the potential for just a moral outrage if something like this happens, which could lead to redistribution of wealth or any number of things. But if you have any preliminary thoughts.
I think economists should be attentive to the sociological contexts and consequences of economic change and disruption. And it's not that many aren't, but there is a way of thinking about economics that is kind of narrow, that is only looks at questions of development and wealth creation in a very narrow kind of utilitarian or materialistic kind of sense that is not sensitive to disruptions. And the greater, in a way, the velocity of the change and the scope of the change, the greater the cultural, political disruption and instability that can result. So that's just a general observation, and I think my initial impression is AI seems like a technology with the potential for great destabilization and great innovation in that way, which is going to always have trade-offs, and we need to be as attentive to the downsides as the upsides. So that's obviously kind of a general response, but I don't know, Erik, if you want to.
Well, I'm not sure. It's hard to predict the future. Just as an aside, I don't really anticipate mass unemployment as a result of artificial intelligence, but again, the future is hard to predict. One thing that I wonder though is if you ask about moral outrage, what should be the object of our moral outrage in that kind of a situation? The CEOs of the AI companies, the people who use the product, the people who make the decisions to automate part of their operations. There's this tendency in times of transition, or just in general, we like to villainize people out there and not take responsibility for our own kind of apparently mundane either consumption or employment decisions. And so that's just one thought. I don't have it's not a specific answer to your question. It's just another question. If we were to be outraged in such a situation, as in automation generally, what's the target of that moral outrage? Who's culpable?
Who decides?
Who decides?
Did you have a quick question before we conclude?
Just a sec.
Thank you. So, John D. Rockefeller, a couple of the biographers attribute a lot of his material success to his strong faith. I think he was Baptist, and to a own justification that he did to himself, that he had a duty to generate the most amount of value through his own actions, to follow his God's will for him on this earth. And I was wondering if somewhere in your book you guys do an analysis of the Christianity as an institution, the impact of their own interpretation of Christian principles in driving people to generate wealth and utilize that wealth for society's advancement, if that makes sense.
So you're asking if... Sorry, can you reformulate your question?
Yeah. It's the different branches of Christianity, like the Baptists, Catholics, etc., their own interpretation of the Christian principles through time and their respective impacts on the different, on the masses, and on their view on wealth and wealth generation. How has that through time generated or impacted wealth generation and economic prosperity in society? I was just wondering if you guys have an analysis or perhaps future interest in doing this regarding your research.
There's a lot of literature on this. The classic statement is by Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber argued that there's something in Calvinism that facilitates or gives rise to a certain kind of work ethic. Therefore, Calvinist societies are more wealthy, more prosperous. That argument doesn't work for a number of reasons, but there are a lot of studies that look at different denominations and attempt to use denominational differences to predict wealth. The general finding is that Protestant areas are wealthier than Catholic areas. The reason for that is incredibly unclear. Some of it in the literature has to do with literacy, but it's still a field that's kind of contested beyond those very broad terms. So as far as I know, there's really not a lot of evidence that say Baptists are wealthier than Presbyterians or anything along those lines.
Not that granular.
Not that granular. So it's a kind of open question in some sense, but there is that kind of broad evidence correlations between Protestantism and Catholicism, but there's a lot of different reasons for that.
So I don't know of any research that would do the kind of thing that you're talking about with respect to economic outcomes. I will recommend Robert Woodbury's work on liberal democracy and missions and evangelism, and the kind of distinctions he makes with respect to conversionary mission work versus other kinds of mission work that roughly equate to kind of Protestant and Catholic outreach, but not exclusively.
And a lot of that is literacy too.
Yeah.
The missionaries wanted the people to read the Bible. The Protestant missionaries wanted people to read the Bible, so they taught them how to read. That's at least a kind of broad consensus in economic history literature.
I mean, the question would not be like kind of focused different, like one like section of Christianity better than the other, but like the overall like current feeling the Christian institution as a whole incentivizes different individuals and their like different ways of seeing wealth. If that makes sense. Which was
Yeah, let's pursue afterwards.
All right. With that note of ambiguity and continuity.
Still much to discuss.
There's a lot to discuss and discover. Thanks so much to both of you for a very insightful conversation. And thanks to all of you for participating, and look for our next event on behalf of Christians for Capitalism. Good night.